Good day, Marians. Welcome to another interesting discussion on the contemporary world, particularly on the topic of the globalization of economy. In our previous discussion, we were able to discuss the genesis of the nations wherein we were able to identify 6 stages in which some of the countries had followed, but it does not mean that all of the countries all over the world followed the same process. We were also able to identify the first international accord that happened in the history, particularly on the event of the Peace of Westphalia to end the 30 Years' War. The Peace of Westphalia, based from the previous discussion, was the best example of the first international accord, as we made mention a while back, because it created what we call the concept of sovereignty, in which there should be no international interference between and among nations. We were able to discuss the various internationalist ideas, such as the liberal internationalism and lastly, the socialist internationalism. For this day, our discussion shall focus on the globalization of economy. So before we dive into our discussion, let's begin first with the lesson objective. So at the end of this discussion, we should be able to define global economy. Number two, identify the actors that facilitate economic globalization. Number three, discuss the modern world economic system. And lastly, we should articulate a stance on the global economic integration. So let's begin. For us to be able to understand our discussion, we should define first what is economy. So according to Investopedia, an economy is the large set of interrelated production and consumption activities that aid in determining how scarce resources are allocated. Moreover, the production and consumption of goods and services are used to fulfill the needs of those living and operating within the economy, which is also referred to as an economic system. Okay, so in order for us to understand it further, I prepared here a diagram. Okay, this figure now is called the circular flow of economic activity, and we can see here that there is a process that is going on. So we have first to look into the different processes that are here. We have here the business income, the payment for resources, the income from resources, and of course the consumer spending. To explain it in an easy manner, we can say that the individuals or the people get their money from their business or from the business that they are working to. For example, if they are employed in the business, they are being paid by means of their salary, and then their salary now becomes their income from resources. Okay, so individuals now have the money, so this money will be used for them to buy their needs in the product markets, and then from here it will go to the business and it will become their profit. So as we can notice, it just reflected a cycle or a circular flow. Okay, so in short, the business here provides the goods and services that the individual needs, and then in exchange for that, they have to pay for those goods and services. So those activities and actions and operations that involve the production and sale of goods and services is called economic process. Okay, so now that we know what economy is all about, let's try to look into what international economics means. So, international economics deals with the economic activities of various countries and their consequences. So, if we're looking into economy, it is also called as the global economy or world economy. World economy refers to the international exchange of goods and services. Of course, that is expressed in money. So it may also mean that Global economy is for the free movement of goods, capitals, services, technology, and information. Moreover, international economics also studies the economic and political issues related to international trade and, of course, finance, particularly on the different kinds of economic system that countries have. So international trade, on the other hand, involves the exchange of goods and or services and other factors of production such as labor and capital, and it should be always in the international border. Next, international finance, on the other hand, studies the flow of financial assets or investments across borders. International trade and finance became possible across nations only due to the emergence of globalization. Okay, so it's quite relevant for us to discuss the existence of the Bretton Woods system because this is one of the main factors of economic globalization. So, after the two world wars, world leaders sought to create a global economic system that would ensure a long-lasting global peace. And they believed that one of the ways rather, to achieve this goal was to set up a network of global financial institutions that would promote economic interdependence and the prosperity. So, this is now the Bretton Woods system, which was inaugurated in 1944 during the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference. So, delegates at the Bretton Woods system agreed to create two financial institutions, and the first one is the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which is now the World Bank, to be responsible for funding post-war reconstruction project. Actually, the Philippines had availed on this program of the IBRD because we were actually devastated by the World War II. So the IBRD was a critical institution at a time when many of the world's cities had been destroyed by the war. So the second one is the International Monetary Fund, which was to be which was to be the global lender of the last resort to prevent individual countries from spiraling into credit crisis. So if economic growth in a country slowed down because there was not enough money to stimulate the economy, the IMF would step in. So to this day, both these institutions remain key players in economic globalization. So, shortly after the Bretton Woods, various countries also committed themselves to further global economic integration through the Agreement on Tariffs and Trades, or the GATT, in 1947. So, its main purpose was to reduce tariffs and other hindrances to free trade. Let's proceed to the global economy and the development of the modern world system. As previously mentioned, global economy is also referred to as the world economy. So this term refers to the international, I repeat, international exchange of goods and services that is expressed in monetary units or money. It may also mean as the free movement of goods and services or capitals, technology, and information. So according to Sanquan 2000, economic globalization refers to the increasing interdependence of world economies as a result of the growing scale of cross-border trade of commodities and services, flow of international capital, and wide and rapid spread of technologies. Now, economic globalization is also concerned on the globalization of production, finance, markets, technology, organizational institutions, corporations, and labor as well. But for other people, business-driven globalization means a threatening livelihoods, uprooting old ways of life and culture. So this gives now the negative effects of economic globalization that can happen in our day-to-day lives, such as, for example, the bankruptcy of small-scale businesses because of the existence of the international, corporations or businesses, and on the other hand, because of the impact or the influence of international brands or products, our culture is slowly changing, or shall we say, diminishing. Moreover, it is again defined here that international economics refers to a study of international forces that influence domestic conditions of an economy and shape the economic relationship between countries. So, in other words, it studies the economic interdependence between countries and its effects on the economy. And the scope of international economics is wide, as it includes various concepts such as globalization, gains from trade, pattern of trade, balance of payments, and FDI. So apart from this, international economies describe production, trade, and investment between countries. So let's have a simple rationalization about this definition of international economics. Since it's an activity across borders, it requires now the mutual support or help of the countries which are actually integrated or what we call connected in terms of their economy. Because during this time, we must adhere to the adage that no man is an island. It's quite easier for two or more countries to gain profits at the same time instead of doing it individually. Like Philippines, for example, we are exporting our agricultural products to countries such as China, Singapore, Malaysia, and on the other hand, these countries also export their products to our country. And if we're going to look into these activities now, these activities happen in an international border, but these international activities actually affect our local conditions, as mentioned in this definition. So usually, you may have already heard news in our local network saying that our economy is low, our economy is high, because the economy itself really affects our day-to-day life. This is why studying economics is relevant in this time. In this time. Okay, so it's now relevant for us to look into some of the examples of economic actors. So when we say actors, here are the factors that make the economic process seamless, or the factors that make the economy continue its process. The first one here is the discoveries and inventions, like for example, a new technology for production, for equipment, for travel, telecommunication, machinery, and many others. We also have here the creation of multinational corporations that, of course, establish foreign direct investments to other countries. We also have here the circulation of finance, ideas, and cultures. So what makes it wonderful to live in this era is the availability of information that can be used in order for us to enhance our business and or corporations. And because of this available, information and our capacity to finance our business, it becomes now a rich ground in order for us to grow financially, culturally, and of course, in terms of information as well. Next one is the free market ideology, of course, which has something to do with or market integration later on. So in here, we can just say that the flow of economy will become more seamless there are if there are low to non-existence of, shall we say, trade barriers or economic barriers such as high taxes for import and export. Next one is more liberal economic policies, laws, economies, and of course, social movements. So here are the examples of economic actors. So this time, let's go back to history. So Emanuel Wallerstein explained how political and economic conditions after the breakdown of the feudalism transformed northwestern Europe into predominant commercial and political power. So as previously mentioned, the main political system of Europe before was more of the feudalism. And as of today, we can say that Europe or countries in Europe are some of the most powerful in the world. And by looking into this explanation by Immanuel Wallerstein, we will be able to unveil the reasons, or of course, possible reasons why they became now the world power. We also have here the advent of the capitalist world economy. So we will be able to define what capitalism is all about in this discussion. Of course, in terms of capitalism, it actually provides larger disparities between various economies. Like for example, United States is one of the countries that is capitalist in nature, and we can see that their economy is actually on top in terms of comparison in all of the countries. However, there are also countries that are capitalist, but they're not that rich like United States. Okay, so we will be looking into the possible factors later on why it happened that way. Going back in the history, the medieval Europe is also called as the Dark Ages, and the Dark Ages is a historical periodization traditionally referring to the Middle Ages. And in the Middle Ages, it had a demographic, cultural, and economic deterioration that actually occurred in Western Europe following the decline of the Roman Empire. So this means that there's a lot of negative experiences that the Europeans had during the medieval Europe. So here are they. In the medieval Europe, how they followed the system of feudalism by 1150 to 1300. And of course, there happened to be a severe economic crisis between 1300 to 1450. And we know that if there are economic crises that happen in a certain place, it follows what we call the civil war. Okay, so there have been an agricultural production fell down, or of course it remained stagnant, and the economic cycle of the feudal economy reached its optimum level. So afterwards, the economy began to shrink. And a shift in climatological conditions decreased agricultural productivity and contributed to an increased epidemics within the population. So looking into all of these things that happened during the medieval prelude, we can conclude that the countries in the Western Europe were in serious condition or they're in trouble. So as a pre-existing solution to the problem in the medieval Europe, they were able to come up with a new division of labor that actually encouraged the capitalist world economy. So the new capitalist world system was based on the international division of labor that determined relationships between different regions as well as the different types of labor conditions within each region. So this model will be looking into the types of political system that also were directly related to each region's placement within the world economy. So here are now the categories that Wallerstein proposed in which places around the world can be categorized or classified into. We have here the core, the periphery, the semi-periphery, and of course number four. This is number four, external. So let's begin with the core. So the core is during that time was more of the northwestern Europe, such as the England, France, Holland, and they were considered as the first core region. So from the name itself, we can assume that this is the center, okay? The center of political activities, the center of commerce, trade, and the like. So politically, the states within this part of Europe was developed or had developed strong central governments, exclusive extensive bureaucracies rather, and large mercenary armies. So looking at into this description about the core, we can assume that they are one of the most they are actually the most powerful countries in Europe. So this permitted the local bourgeoisie to obtain control over the international commerce and extract capital surpluses from the trade for their own benefit. Okay, so as a rural population expanded, the small but increasing number of landless wage earners provided labor for farms and manufacturing activities. So this happens all the time. Usually, the people who are classified into the middle or the lower strata, they are actually looking or they are working into the dirty works. They are the or they become the employees. Okay, so independent farmers squeezed out many peasants of the land, and then soon after they moved to the cities for cheap labor. This actually happens in the Philippines as well. Like there is a tendency for the poor people in the provinces or in the periphery to go in the city because they perceive that they'll be given much opportunities for them to look for work or to look for a decent job in the metropolitan areas, but it does not guarantee that if you go to Manila you will be given a work. Some people end up you know living under the bridges or becoming squatters, and it creates now more serious social issues, like, for example, uh, robbery, killings, and the like. So, in here, the agricultural productivity increased with growing predominance on the commercially oriented independent farmers and the rise of pastoralism and improved farm technology. I would like to highlight here the commercially oriented independent farmer because this has a reflection of what um, capitalist economy is all about. So if you are giving freedom to an individual to operate his or her own business with, shall we say, small to non-government intervention, they can be the best version of themselves. Like they if they want to get more profit or they get more money, they will exhaust all possibilities to to innovate themselves and to create more opportunities for them to to rise above all, something like that. And that is a good thing about capitalist economy compared to command economy, because in the command economy, the government itself decides in all the economic activities that happen within their country. Okay, so these are the things about the core. Okay, so the next category is the periphery. So in order for us to understand, periphery is actually related to places beyond or outside the center. So if we're going to look into the geographical location, so the periphery can be the provinces or something like the rural areas. So in the medieval Europe, the periphery mostly were the colonized areas because the colonizer exported raw materials to the core, and they relied on coercive labor practices. And of course, it generated through unequal trade relations, like in the Philippine experience during the Spanish and even in the American colonization. The Philippines has a vast, resources in terms of agriculture and raw materials in which the countries were exhausting these materials or these resources, and then they transport it to their own countries for processing. And then later on, the finished products will be sold in the Philippines. So, that's a simple form of injustice for me. Okay, so the periphery were the peripheral areas were in West Eastern Europe, especially in Poland and even in Latin America, like, for example, in Mexico. So Mexico was also colonized by Spanish, the same with the Philippines. And to gain sufficient cheap and easily controlled labor, landlords forced rural workers into a second serfdom or their commercial estates. So local government were replaced by weak bureaucracies. So if we are having this kind of weak bureaucracies, of course, we expect for corruption, like, during the Spanish colonization in the Philippines. Okay, landlords became aristocratic capitalist farmers, and of course, enslavement of native coercive labor practices made possible to export of raw materials to Europe. And lastly, labor systems in both peripheral areas differed from earlier forms in medieval Europe in that they were established to produce goods for a capitalist world economy and not merely for international consumption. So the next category is the semi-periphery. So the semi-periphery is, of course, is in between the two extremes wherein it can be the declining core or improving periphery. So it served as buffers. As such, semi-peripheries exhibited tensions between the central government and the strong local landed class. So in terms of the declining core, we have here the Portugal and Spain. Portugal and Spain in the history became the two world powers, particularly in the time of exploration, like the Spain went to the Philippines looking for spices, something like that. So in that time, they were considered as a two world powers. Okay, some other countries can be categorized as semi-peripheries during that time, such as Italy, southern Germany, and southern France. So unlike the core, they failed to predominate in international trade because, of course, they have still a weak reputation in terms of the trade because they are still, um, you know, they are still not that powerful such as the core. So they accepted the concept of sharecropping. So this lessened the risk of crop failure now. So according to Wallerstein, the semi-peripheries were exploited by the core, but as in the case of American empire, such as in terms of how do you call this? But in the experience of American empires of Spain and Portugal, such as Mexico, they were exploiters of the peripheries themselves. So, in short, the core exploited the semi periphery, and the semi peripheries exploited the periphery. So, that is the logic behind that. Spain, for example, imported silver and gold from its American colonies and obtained largely through coercive labor practices. But most of this specie went to paying for manufactured goods from the core countries such as England and France rather than encouraging the formation of domestic manufacturing sector. So in order for us to look into, to understand further the semi-periphery, the best example that I can give here is about Mexico, as previously mentioned. So Mexico and the Philippines were both colonies of Spain in the past. However, Mexico got its independence earlier than the Philippines. However, in the past, there existed what we call the galleon trade, if you still remember that, the Manila Acapulco galleon trade. So in the Philippines, the products and of course the essential minerals, the gemstones, something like that, were loaded in a galleon or a ship, and then it's actually transported to Mexico in a form of international trade. Okay, so the galleon trade can be considered as one of the earliest example of international trade between Philippines and then the Mexico. So Mexico during that time was considered as a periphery because they were colony. But when they were given the independence, they can be considered now as a semi-periphery because, of course, they are a periphery that is developing or developing periphery. Okay. So next category is the external areas. So they do not belong to the core, periphery, and then the semi-periphery because these are the places that can maintain their own economic systems and manage to remain outside the modern world economy. Like, for example, Russia. So, unlike Poland, Russia's wheat served primarily to supply its internal market. So, they did not, you know, engage in international trade because within their economy, they can already supply the needs and, of course, the demands of their people. Okay? So it traded with Asia as well as in Europe. Internal commerce remained more important than trade with outside regions, but also considerable power of the Russian state helped regulate the economy and limited foreign commercial influence. But of course, comparing this argument as of today, we have made mention a while back that it's actually strategic if countries have allies in terms of economic activities because no man is an island. And countries would gain further or would gain better if they have connections in terms of the trade or what we call the international trade. That's why I think the concept of external areas, um, the concepts behind the external areas are no longer observed as of today. Okay, so in conclusion, international economic integration is a central factor for globalization. Much of globalization now is anchored on changes in the economy, like, for example, global culture. Global culture is facilitated by, of course, trade. Filipinos would not be as aware of American culture, if not for the fact that they traded with us in terms of their movies, in terms of their music, in terms of their food, and the like. So the globalization of politics is likewise largely contingent on trade relations because these days many events of foreign affairs are actually conducted to cement trading relations between and among states. So, given the stakes involved in the economic globalization, it is actually important to ask how the system can be made more just or equal. Because, although some of elements of global free trade can be scaled back, politics or policies rather cannot do away with it as a whole because of course international policymakers therefore should strive to think of ways on how to make trading deals fairer between countries because governments must also continue to of course devise a way of cautioning the most damaging effects of economic globalization while ensuring that uh, it benefits everyone. So this ends now our discussion on this chapter. Goodbye.